Hello, everyone. This is Jonathan from SQM Group. We will start the broadcast shortly here. I'm just going to give another minute maybe for people to join the line. I'll do a few bookkeeping items, housekeeping items, and then we'll get started shortly. All right, well, welcome everyone to the presentation on survey methodology best practices. My name is Jonathan Beppel, and I'm a senior analyst with SQM Group. I'll just go over a few quick housekeeping items before we start. So you are welcome to ask questions through the presentation through the question field in GoToMeeting, or you are also welcome to email your questions to us. We'll have a Q&A period at the end where we will address a couple of questions, and if we can't get to everybody, we will reach out to you after the fact to address your question. You can get a copy of this recording after the fact. We will be recording both the audio and video and providing that. And there's also, you should see a link on GoToMeeting for a handout, which is a PDF version of this presentation. So to get things moving, like I say, my name is Jonathan Beppel. I am a senior analyst with SQM Group. And I've been here for about 3 years. So what do I do here? Why am I the one telling you about survey methodologies? Well, I work in data analysis, quality assurance. I do some customized research both internally and externally for our clients. I've been a part of the journey mapping and client consultation team for about 1.5 years now. And so I'm here to give you some context to survey methodologies and the best practices that we have developed here at SQM through our 22, going on 23 years now. So I hope you're all in the right room, because today we're here to talk about, like I mentioned, survey methodologies. So why would we talk about this? Why is this important? Well, we find that organizations that conduct post-contact surveys to understand their customer experience are more likely to improve that customer experience than organizations that only use internal metrics. It's a best practice to gather your voice of the customer feedback by actually asking your customer. And that might sound obvious, but there are many organizations that attempt to use internal metrics as a proxy for voice of the customer feedback. And at the end of the day, voice of the customer feedback is unique because it comes directly from your customer, and that's where you should get it. So in today's webinar, I'll try and outline a bit of a business case for why you should be conducting surveys to measure your customer experience. We'll also be going over some differences between different types of surveying, so transaction and perception surveys, what makes them different and why you might want to do one over the other. We'll go over some survey methodologies, including their acceptance rates and pros and cons of the different methods. And then we'll also be addressing some of the best practices for measuring customer experience across your organization's core contact channels. So if you are unfamiliar with SQM Group, there are a few new names in the window that I'm seeing today. So if you're unfamiliar with SQM Group, here's a short overview. We are an organization whose primary purpose is to help other organizations improve their customer and employee experience performance. And we do that in a variety of ways. So we do a lot of customer experience research at SQM. We're a leading specialist firm for measuring, benchmarking, and improving customer and employee experience. And we do that through our own internal call center, email surveys, IVR surveys. We conduct all of that CX research internally in-house. We then use that research to consult to our clients on best practices and approaches and help them improve their CX by providing improvement opportunity suggestions. And then finally, we do customer experience awarding. So for customers and also non-clients with particularly good best practices, we will award on a yearly basis the leaders in industry and the leaders across industry as well, in both North America and internationally. So we at SQM have been doing this, like I mentioned, for 22 going on 23 years. We benchmark with over 500 companies. We do 1.5 million surveys on an annual basis. And we do the large majority of our work in America. We have 71% in America, 26% in Canada, and 3% internationally. And so we have good benchmarking metrics on both sides of the border, both north and south, and on the east and west coast. So let's get into the business case for Voice of the Customer survey. So I mentioned this earlier, but the Voice of the Customer metrics versus internal metrics is a very important distinction. And often call center managers will tend to use internal metrics such as service level, average handle time, call monitoring as proxies for customer service and customer satisfaction. But that's not always reliable. Think of a call center manager that's managing to average handle time. Often if you see an average handle time in the 20-minute, 30-minute range, that would be extremely excessive from a manager perspective. And they might consider that to be indication of poor customer satisfaction. But there are leaders in the industry, Zappos as an example, who are famous for their long average handle time. Zappos' example is a 10-hour call that they were able to achieve incredible customer satisfaction through, and they manage to that. They're not focused on the average handle time, they're focused on the actual customer satisfaction. Because at the end of the day, management's interpretation of the customer's service experience and the customer satisfaction can be completely different than the customer's own interpretation of their experience. So changing from internal metrics to Voice of the Customer metrics can be a challenge for an organization, culturally and operationally. People might have either performance management targets based on those metrics, and so that operational change can be a challenge. And often management at the end of the day does not want to let go of the control of judging the call center's performance. But if the goal of the call center is to be customer-centric, the goal of your organization is to be customer-centric, then you have to let the customer be the judge of their own experience. We hear this time and time again from customers. They tell us that they want to be the judge of their own experience. It can be challenging because, like I say, there are either operational or cultural norms in place if you are an organization that focuses on internal metrics. But like I say, that perception of what internally is thought of important to the customer versus what the customer thinks is important can be very different. So if you were to ask a call center manager or senior manager what they think is most important to the customer, they might give you answers around, being rewarded for loyalty is very important to customers, or providing a personalized customer service is incredibly important to customers. And although those things do play a role, when we ask customers across industry, across Canada and the States, what the most important thing is for them and what their priority is when calling in to a contact center, it is a resounding confirmation that they want to have their inquiry resolved. That is the key point for any customer, and that should be an exciting thing for an organization to hear. And I'll tell you why, because resolution, unlike the other pieces on this list here, resolution is very achievable for a call rep. If instead, let's say internally, your organization says, we want to have these, very personalized customer service experience. What does that mean to a customer service representative? How can they impact that personalized customer service experience? And it can be a challenge to directly link the customer service representative's performance to that personalized customer service, because that personalized customer service might be, is by definition different for each customer. It can be very challenging to provide an improvement plan for your customer service representatives around, providing that service. Whereas resolution is something that's directly connected to how they do as a customer service representative. They can see the link between how they've handled their call, and whether the customer believes that that call was resolved. Resolution is a very easy metric to be able to performance management against because it's very easy to connect it, like I say, directly to the customer service representative. It is what we would consider to be a leading indicator or a leading metric. So with contact resolution as a metric of choice, it is very easy to set targets and then work towards achieving improvement in those targets. If you're resolving 3 out of 4 calls, it can be very easy to try and understand how to get that 4th call. If it's an issue of providing more knowledge to the customer, that's very workable. You can target that directly. Whereas something like a Net Promoter Score, which is very, very popular, but we would consider a lagging metric, Net Promoter Score has a lot of pieces that feed into it. It's a metric that is trying to ask, would you recommend us to your friends and family for the Net Promoter Score? And there can be a lot of reasons that somebody might recommend or might not recommend. It might include things like, how is their emotional experience through that call? Were they satisfied with the call representative? Were they satisfied with the contact center in general or the organization? There are many pieces that kind of feed into Net Promoter Score, making it a lagging indicator and making it very challenging to directly connect the Net Promoter Score performance to a single agent. Because at the end of the day, the agent is unsure of which piece of the story or which piece of the journey for your customers they can influence to actually improve the experience or the Net Promoter Score. Whereas for call resolution, there is a very direct link between what the call representative does and the perception of your customer. So, although contact resolution is the leading indicator and metric to hold a call center rep accountable to, ideally the metric you want to try and push for is that first contact resolution. The difference here being that a CSR might be unable to get first contact resolution because they may be given a customer that has already called in once or twice before. So not as easy to directly tie that to a customer service rep's performance, but first contact resolution is incredibly important because we can tie direct benefits to the first contact resolution metric. So some of those benefits that I'm talking to are first, the reduction in operating costs. So we see across the board that for a 1% improvement in FCR, you will reduce your operating costs by about 1%. There's also a similar improvement in customer satisfaction. For every 1% improved in FCR, there's a 1% improvement in customer satisfaction. There's also improved employee satisfaction. We see up to a 5% improvement in employee satisfaction for every percentage gain in FCR. And that's just because employees want to help people at the end of the day. CSRs want to help. And if they are able to help more frequently, one, their customers are more happy, which is always better to deal with a happy customer. And two, they're getting less callbacks. So all in all, that makes a better employee experience. So number 4, we also see increased opportunities to cross-sell. So when a customer's call is resolved, the customer is much more accepting of the cross-selling opportunities presented. And finally, it also reduces customers at risk. So 98% of customers will continue to do business with an organization as a result of achieving that first contact resolution. So hopefully kind of all of this together gives you a bit of a perspective on the business case for why you should be collecting voice of the customer surveys and why you should be getting them directly from your customers, not trying to have some sort of proxy. So now that we've kind of created a business case for that, let's talk about the survey collection methods. So first, I'd like to get into the distinction between some different types of surveys. So right now, I'm categorizing them generally into 2 forms. So there's the perception surveys and transaction surveys. So perception surveys are primarily used to examine the customer's entire relationship with the customer, whereas transaction surveys focus on a specific and recent customer transaction using some sort of contact channel. And so to give you an example of why this is an important distinction between the two is because they can yield very different results. So the example I have here is, consider a customer who has had their billing information lost by the organization, resulting in a late payment and a discontinuation of service. That's a bad experience. Nobody likes that. So when the customer calls into the organization to try and resolve the issue, the CSR is able to reinstate that service, waive the missed fee, and achieve that first contact resolution. That's great. That's what we want. But if you were to give that customer a perception survey, they may be dissatisfied with their overall experience with the company or the overall relationship with the company, because at the end of the day, it was the organization that lost the information and caused this discontinuation of service. That's frustrating. But a transaction survey that focuses on that call that customer made to the call center, transaction survey might show that they were actually very satisfied with the call center transaction or with the transaction with the customer service representative. So they are two different types of surveys, and they reveal different types of information for different purposes. So perception surveys, they can often be conducted on a regular basis, whereas transaction surveys, since they are dependent on a recent transaction, they are very much dependent on how frequently a transaction occurs. For perception surveys, we see that they provide insights into the overall customer experience with the company's products and services, whereas the transaction survey, it provides kind of an immediate snapshot, quick insight into the customer experience of using a particular contact channel. Perception surveys tend to be preferred by B2B companies, where that relationship between the customer and the organization can be a bit more involved, a bit more frequent, and a bit more important. When the average spend of your customer as a B2B company can be quite a bit higher than a B2C company. So then the transaction surveys, conversely, they can be preferred by B2C companies because they might have much more frequent interactions or transactions with their customers. That's not to say that perception or transaction surveys can't be done for both B2B and B2C companies, but depending on what your objectives are, the types of customers that you have, et cetera, it might change the way that you produce these surveys or which types of surveys you use. And for both types of surveys, you can use both of them to get at what we consider to be customer loyalty metrics. So things like CX greatness, that net promoter score, and the net retention index. Those questions can be asked in both a perception and a transaction survey, and can be a great way to try and line up results from the different surveys. If you ask results in both, you can say, for the promoters in the transaction surveys, how did they perceive the transaction? Now, what is the perception survey results of those promoters or people that said that the customer experience was great? So the customer loyalty metrics can be a great way to tie in these two types of surveying methods or types of studies. So we see, depending on the type that you use, different results. So for the transaction surveys, we tend to have a higher satisfaction, a higher greatness score, whereas the perception surveys, it's a little lower. And so this is somewhat expected in the sense that people for the perception surveys are thinking of a very large selection of issues they might have had with the organization, and as a result, that can tend to lower the scores. Whereas for transaction surveys, generally they've just done one single recent interaction, and often, hopefully, it's been a good transaction, and so they tend to be, in general, a bit happier about that. So when and where do you do these surveys? Well, there are a lot of channels that you might want to survey. We find that you can get deep insight into the contact channel performance through getting voice of the customer metrics through many different channels. So you might want to survey your call center's performance, your web self-service performance, your email performance, even down to the local branch or store. And the way that you can get information on these different contact channels that your organization might have is by doing, live surveys or email surveys, outbound IVR. Tablet kiosk is a great option for that local store if you have one. And then there's also web pop-up is very, very common. So let's take a look a bit at these survey methodologies, the commonalities and what makes them different. So if we're looking at the different types of methods, we can see that for across the board live, outbound IVR, and email, it's best to collect these surveys within 24 hours of the interaction. The survey should include some sort of rating questions to get a quantitative result, but they should also include an open-ended question so that they can get more of that qualitative, deep feedback and improvement suggestions. And the open-ended questions, it's best to transcribe them into text and ideally code them into kind of common responses, because out of 100 surveys, you will probably get 100 uniquely written responses, but they're probably talking about relatively similar things. And finally, the commonality between these three is that the quota should be managed from an organization level down to a CSR level. And so what we mean by that is if you were to just manage the quota on organizational level, say you want 400 surveys in the month, you might find if you're not managing down to a CSR level that, one CSR is getting 20 surveys for the work that they have done, whereas another CSR is only getting, one or two. And that can be challenging because, everyone has off days, and if that CSR that only got 1 or 2 surveys, those happen to be on their off days and the quota wasn't managed properly, all of a sudden that CSR's metrics drop, and that can be a very challenging thing and a frustrating thing for your employees. So the differentiators between the three, the live interviews, they allow for that more in-depth personal approach. The IVR, it is more viable for a large actionable quotas for the CSRs. It can be easier if you're trying to get 10 surveys per month per CSR. It can be easier to do that through IVR or even email, as opposed to getting live interviews. The pros of the live interview is that it has the highest quality feedback, whereas the con is that that's associated with the highest cost. The outbound IVR, the survey length is shorter. It's more challenging to get people to respond to a robot than a live person at the end of the day. And because of that, less feedback than a live survey. And in email, it's a very well-established, popular technology. People are very familiar with email surveys, but not every customer might have an email, particularly depending on the industry. So we see across these different survey methodologies, different kind of quality of feedback, and our ability to get feedback is a little bit different across these methods. For live, we see generally a 25-to-1 acceptance ratio, which means we have to make 25 calls to get one survey. IVR, it's 26-to-1. Email, it's 14-to-1. We find that of the surveys we do collect in live, 93% have feedback, and on average, that's about 24 seconds worth of feedback. In the IVR, we see about 86% with shorter feedback, about 12 seconds. And then in email, more have feedback, but it has relatively less of it. So you can use something called mixed methodology approaches, which combines these three that we've just talked about to try and get the best of both worlds in a sense. So mixed methodology is when you use email with live or IVR surveys. And you would do this so that you can reach more of your customers. Some customers may have an email address available, while others only have a phone number. So with this method, you can contact both of those. So it provides the benefits of both email and live, while allowing for larger sample size overall and lower overall costs. The pros being that it targets surveys across all populations, regardless of the preference for methodology, and it keeps costs lower, while also allowing for larger quotas. The cons being that live surveys allow more in-depth questions, while email and IVR are shorter. So you might get kind of different types of responses in a sense, depending on if you're doing email and live. And then also many organizations have limited or no email address collection. While on the other end of the spectrum, some people have very limited or no phone number collection, depending on the type of industry you're in. So these aren't just the only survey methodologies. We also have some retail type methodologies. So for our tablet kiosk surveys, the kiosk is placed allowing for customers to complete a survey upon the completion of their transaction. Agent level reporting is possible using either shift schedule or ideally a picture of the employee in the survey so that the person can indicate who they dealt with. And multi-channel questions will allow for some overlap with other channels to provide comparisons. And the kiosk should be positioned very close and prominent to the location of the transaction so that people are eager or more willing to provide feedback for that transaction. The pros include that the in-person agents are able to be held accountable to the same metrics as other channels. So if you have both a retail location and a lot of email servicing, then it allows for some overlap. We can look at that first contact resolution across both people in a retail location and online. Another pro is that it prominently demonstrates to your customers that you value their opinion and that you're willing to get their feedback and hopefully kind of incorporate that into your business practices. The cons are that the kiosk does require physical space on location, and you need to protect it from damage and theft. Additionally, you need a constant Wi-Fi and power source so that the service doesn't shut off, and people, that can be frustrating for a customer if they walk up to try and do a survey, and now they're having a barrier put in place to being able to do that if the Wi-Fi isn't connected or the power's off for the tablet. And finally, the last survey method we'll talk about today is the website pop-up surveys. So these are pop-up surveys that are implemented on a client's website, and users who accept the survey, they'll have a new tab that opens up in their browser, and they can complete that survey once they're done visiting the website. Now, this tends to have the lowest acceptance rate of the method, so it takes about 100 invitations for one person to do the survey. But web pop-up surveys allow for the customer experience to be measured immediately following the conclusion of a transaction, which that's a very positive thing about web pop-up surveys. So they're well-established technology, allowing for real-time survey collection, and it's a very cost-effective method. The cons being that lower acceptance rates, and then also that the results can be quite polarized because people tend to respond to web pop-ups when they're either very angry or happily surprised, which that can still provide very reliable feedback for giving you insights into the trending issues that might be coming up, or the things that are making people most aggravated or most happy, which that can be very valuable information to have. The web pop-ups, here's some examples that we have. These can be very customized, whether being viewed on a monitor or on a mobile. In terms of the colors and logos, et cetera, those can all be changed, but this just gives you an idea of what it might look like if you haven't seen a web pop-up in the past 10 years. So to kind of round this out, let's talk about why we at SQM believe that customer experience improvement opportunities come through voice of the customer surveys. And we believe that because we have a proven track record of it. We have a mission statement that is to help our organizations improve their customer and employee experience performance one individual at a time. And we in fact see that 70% of our clients have improved their first call resolution by conducting post-contact surveys. And in general, our average client has an SCR rating of 72%, which is quite good. And this last little operational piece, that 1% SCR improvement that we talked about earlier for our average call center, that means almost $300,000 in operational savings. So it's a metric that should be, definitely looked at within an organization. It's something that we can hold the CSRs accountable to, and that has a very concrete benefit to improving. So I'd like to, open it up to a couple of questions now. We're getting close to the end of time, so maybe not as many questions as we anticipated, but thank you all for your attention. I'll look over to the questions for now. Okay, I'm seeing there's a couple questions on the timeliness of the surveys. It's kind of a two-part question here that I'll answer. So this person asks, why should customers be surveyed within 24 hours? So it's a best practice to survey the customers within that 24-hour window because the customer's experience will be fresh in their mind, and they'll therefore be more capable of providing, an accurate account of their experience. And kind of the second question that seems to go with this is, do you see lower or higher results in voice to the customer surveys if the surveying is completed prior to or after the 24 hours? Well, this one's kind of an interesting one because it can kind of go both ways. For example, if you were to survey a customer 10 minutes after a call, let's say, um, but it will take the call customer service representative 2 hours to actually resolve the issue. So say somebody's calling with a billing issue. They contact the CSR. The CSR says, "Yep, I'll pass this information along, get this resolved for you." But that process is actually going to take 2 hours. If the customer gets a call 10 minutes after, the customer may either assume that the CSR did do the task or will do the task, and that can potentially inflate your results since the CSR may not actually do that task. Um, or the caller may indicate that the issue was not resolved, even though the CSR is in the process of resolving that issue, and therefore that would deflate your results. So it can kind of go both ways. Conversely, if the survey is too late, the customer may be more certain of whether the resolution, was there and was actually achieved, but they may be less sure about some of the nuanced questions that we like to ask. Things like, how is the emotional experience working with the organization, or what is customer satisfaction for the CSR versus the satisfaction with the organization. Additionally, if the goal is to get feedback on a specific transaction, the further out you go from that transaction, the more noise there's going to be in the person's perception. More dissatisfaction might be able to cloud that response as they start to consider, other aspects of the organization, and they start thinking more on that perception survey perspective as opposed to, the specific transaction. So timeliness is important. That 24-hour period, is a good rule of thumb to measure for that resolution. So it looks like we are getting pretty close to that time. I should wrap it up here, but if I haven't responded to any of the other questions, we will reach out to you via email to touch base and provide some insights. So I wanted to thank everybody for taking the time to be here with us today and listen to our presentation. And I hope you found it informative and interesting to some degree, and hope to see you on many more webinars to come. So thank you all very much.